The Tudors are remembered for power, scandal, and the 6 wives of Henry VIII. Most people know the familiar story: Catherine of Aragon, cast aside after years of loyal service, and Boleyn, executed in the shadow of betrayal; Jane Seymour, who gave Henry his long-awaited son but paid with her life; Anne of Cleves, the unwanted bride; Catherine Howard, the tragic young queen; and Catherine Parr, the survivor. But what if there is more to this story than broken marriages and dramatic deaths? What if behind the famous names lies a web of hidden connections that bound England to the rest of Europe in ways we rarely imagine? Every queen who sat beside Henry carried with her centuries of lineage, noble bloodlines that reached across kingdoms and dynasties. Catherine of Aragon linked the Tudors directly to Spain and the mighty Habsburg Empire, and Boleyn's kinship touched the royal lines of Scotland. Jane Seymour's blood tied her distantly to imperial houses whose reach extended far beyond England's shores. Anne of Cleves represented not just a German duchy, but a network of Protestant alliances that could have altered Europe's balance of power. Catherine Howard's lineage pulled England back into its own Plantagenet past, while Catherine Parr tied the dynasty to the enduring Yorkist line and the memory of the Wars of the Roses. This is not just the story of one king's marriages. It is the story of how blood, alliance, and ancestry shaped politics, religion, and history across an entire continent. Each queen brought with her far more than beauty or scandal. She carried the weight of a family legacy that could sway crowns, forge alliances, and even threaten the stability of Henry's reign itself. Welcome to our channel, Words of Time. In this video, we will uncover the unseen royal connections of Henry VIII's queens and reveal how their hidden family webs changed not only England, but also the fate of Europe. For many people who are drawn to English history, the name Henry VIII comes to mind before almost any other. He is remembered for his imposing presence, his role in breaking England away from Rome, and of course his 6 wives. The stories of Catherine of Aragon and Boleyn, Jane Seymour, and of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr have become familiar to schoolchildren and historians alike. These women are often presented mainly as victims or survivors of Henry's temper, power, and ambition. Yet this focus on their personal lives with Henry can obscure a much deeper truth. Each of them carried with her a lineage that stretched far beyond the English court. Their family ties connected England to dynasties across Europe, some stretching back centuries, some involving forgotten or overlooked branches of ruling families whose influence shaped politics, religion, and war across the continent. If we step away from the familiar stories of Henry's dramatic marriages, we find that the web of connections surrounding him is richer and more surprising than many realize. Take Catherine of Aragon as the first example. She is remembered mostly for her long and painful marriage to Henry and her refusal to give up her title as his lawful wife when he sought an annulment. But to think of her only in these terms is to miss the extraordinary depth of her heritage. Catherine was the daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the monarchs who united Spain and whose names are still remembered for completing the Reconquista and sponsoring Christopher Columbus. Through her parents, Catherine was tied to some of the most powerful dynasties in Europe, including the Trastamara and Habsburg houses. Her lineage did not stop at Spain, though. From her mother's side, she was connected to ancient Castilian rulers, while from her father's side, she descended from Aragonese kings who had once ruled large parts of the Mediterranean. Through these branches, her family reached back to dynasties in France, Italy, and even the Holy Roman Empire. These connections meant that when Catherine arrived in England as a young bride intended for Henry's older brother Arthur, she was not just a princess of Spain. She carried with her the combined prestige of multiple European crowns. She was related by blood or marriage to many of the continent's most influential rulers, and her presence in England was part of a broader strategy to tie the Tudor dynasty, still relatively new and insecure on the throne, to the long-established and widely respected monarchies of Spain. This was more than just a marriage alliance. It was a calculated step toward ensuring the Tudors were seen as equal players in European politics. Without Catherine's background, Henry's early reign would have lacked much of its international weight. The story becomes even more striking when we trace Catherine's ancestors further back. Through Isabella of Castile, Catherine could claim descent from John of Gaunt, the English prince who was a son of Edward III. This gave her Plantagenet blood, linking her directly to English royal history before she ever set foot in the country. Through this line, Catherine was distantly related to her own husband. This kind of interwoven genealogy was common among European ruling families, but it had real political meaning. When Henry later tried to cast off Catherine by claiming their marriage had been cursed, Catherine could point to her own royal blood as a sign of the marriage's legitimacy. She was not some minor princess, but a woman with a heritage as weighty as Henry's, if not more so. Her background also had consequences that reached far beyond her marriage. When Henry broke from Rome in order to end his union with her, he was not just discarding a wife. He was rejecting the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the aunt of the powerful Emperor Charles V. This decision triggered anger in Spain and hostility in the wider Catholic world. It also reshaped English foreign policy for generations, drawing the kingdom into conflicts and alliances that would not have existed without Catherine's powerful relatives. In this way, the unseen royal lines behind her proved decisive in shaping not only the Tudor dynasty, but also the fate of England itself. Catherine's case is only the beginning of a much broader story. Every one of Henry's wives, as well as many of his other relatives, carried hidden connections to wider dynastic networks. These connections reveal a picture of the Tudor world that was far less insular than it might appear when we focus only on Henry himself. Anne Boleyn, for example, though not from a reigning dynasty, was tied to the powerful Howard family in England and had spent much of her youth in the French court. There she absorbed not only the culture and fashion of Renaissance France, but also its political spirit. Through service to Queen Claude of France and time spent among the elite of Burgundy and the Netherlands, and became linked to some of the most vibrant courts in Europe. These experiences and connections shaped her vision of what it meant to be queen, and they helped fuel the religious and political changes that came during her marriage to Henry. Jane Seymour, though often seen as a quiet and modest figure, also brought with her family ties that were not without importance. The Seymours were not as prominent as the Howards or the Tudors, but they were rising, and their links to other noble families gave them influence that would grow after Jane became queen. Her brothers Edward and Thomas would become central figures in the reign of Henry's son, Edward VI. Here again we see that even a seemingly minor connection, like Jane's link to the broader English nobility, could play a critical role in shaping the course of the dynasty. Anne of Cleves is perhaps the clearest case of how hidden connections could shape events. Her marriage to Henry was arranged to tie England to the powerful Protestant states of Germany. The Duchy of Cleves itself was not a great power, but through Anne's family, the Tudors hoped to build an alliance against the Catholic Emperor Charles V. That the marriage ended in annulment after only a few months is often treated as a personal failure or a comic story about Henry's disappointment in her looks. But behind this failed union lay serious European politics. The attempt to link the Tudors to German princes shows how much Henry relied on the web of dynastic marriages to protect his kingdom, even when those unions did not last. Anne's family ties placed England briefly in a broader Protestant network, reminding us again that these wives were more than just domestic figures. The same could be said of Catherine Howard and Catherine Parr, whose family ties connected them to powerful English houses and continental kin. Catherine Howard was part of the Howard family, one of the oldest and most respected noble families in England, with deep connections to the Dukes of Norfolk and through them to other European aristocrats. Catherine Parr, the last of Henry's wives, came from a family with strong ties to northern England and to the broader noble community. Her later marriages and regency role linked her to circles of influence that would shape the reign of her stepdaughter Elizabeth. Looking at all of these women together, it becomes clear that Henry's court was not an isolated place. It was instead a hub in a vast network of dynastic ties. Each wife brought not only her own personality and fate, but also the weight of her ancestry, her foreign relatives, and the political alliances that followed from them. To focus only on Henry's personal desires is to miss how much his reign was shaped by these unseen connections. It is easy to think of forgotten dynasties as background details, but they often played crucial roles in shaping events. Consider how the claim of the Tudor dynasty to the English throne itself rested partly on marriage. Henry VII, father of Henry VIII, had a tenuous claim by blood. It was his marriage to Elizabeth of York, uniting the Lancastrian and Yorkist lines, that gave the Tudors legitimacy. Without this connection, the dynasty might not have survived its early years. Similarly, when we trace back through the family trees of Catherine of Aragon or Anne Boleyn, we find links to rulers whose actions centuries earlier set the stage for what happened in Henry's reign. The point is not just that royalty married royalty, but that these unions created a web of loyalties and rivalries that determined the course of wars, treaties, and reforms. A forgotten cousin in Spain, a distant uncle in Burgundy, a grandmother descended from French kings. These seemingly minor figures could become decisive when questions of inheritance or legitimacy arose. In Catherine of Aragon's case, her powerful nephew Charles V became one of Henry's most formidable opponents. In Anne Boleyn's case, her connections to reformist circles in France and the Netherlands helped bring Protestant ideas into the English court. Even Jane Seymour's brothers, relatively obscure at first, became regents and power brokers after her marriage to Henry. When we step back and look at the larger picture, the Tudor story is not only about Henry and his 6 wives. It is about a dense network of families stretching across Europe, many of them forgotten today, but all of them essential in shaping the destiny of England. These lines remind us that history is not made only by the famous individuals who dominate the spotlight. It is also shaped by the quieter presence of ancestors, cousins, and distant relatives whose names are not well known, but whose blood and alliances carry great weight. By uncovering these connections, we see the Tudor dynasty in a new light. Henry's reign was not only about personal ambition or religious reform. It was part of a much larger European story, one that involved Spanish princesses, French courtiers, German duchesses, and English nobles. The forgotten lines behind these figures gave shape to alliances, wars, and successions that would change the future of Europe. This is the unseen history that lies beyond the spotlight, waiting to be remembered. Catherine of Aragon's story has so often been reduced to the sad image of a wronged wife, clinging to her crown while her husband sought another woman, that it is easy to miss just how vast and powerful her family ties truly were. She was not only the daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, but also a living thread that bound together centuries of European dynasties. To see her only through the lens of her struggles with Henry is to overlook that she arrived in England as one of the most prestigious brides of her age, carrying with her a network of kinship and alliance that spanned from the Iberian Peninsula to the distant courts of Burgundy, France, and even beyond. She was the embodiment of Europe's interwoven houses, and her fall from favor in England was not a private domestic rupture, but a political earthquake that sent shockwaves through many courts. To begin tracing her web, it helps to look first at her parents. Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile were not simply monarchs of neighboring realms who happened to marry. Their union was one of the most significant events in European history, bringing together 2 of the strongest kingdoms on the Iberian Peninsula and setting the stage for the emergence of a unified Spain. Isabella came from the Castilian line, which traced its ancestry back through centuries of rulers who had fought to consolidate power in a land long divided between Christian and Muslim states. Ferdinand, for his part, was heir to the crown of Aragon, which had not only ruled in Spain but also projected influence across the Mediterranean, including parts of Italy and even Sicily. Through their marriage, they created a partnership that gave their children immense prestige. Catherine, as their youngest surviving daughter, was born into a family already shaping the destiny of Europe. But Ferdinand and Isabella themselves were not isolated figures. Isabella's heritage connected her to the Trastamara dynasty, which had ruled Castile and Leon since the 14th century. That line, in turn, had marital ties with French and Portuguese royals, linking Castile to 2 of its nearest and most powerful neighbors. Ferdinand's ancestry reached into the Aragonese kings who had once governed large swathes of the Mediterranean, and who were themselves connected to dynasties in France, Naples, and even the Byzantine Empire. Together, Ferdinand and Isabella gave their children not just crowns, but bloodlines that connected them to nearly every major power in Europe. Catherine of Aragon was therefore part of a remarkable sibling group. Her brothers and sisters were not only figures in Spanish politics, but major players on the European stage. Her older sister Isabella married Manuel I of Portugal, binding Spain and Portugal together at a time when both were expanding into overseas empires. Isabella's children represented a merging of the 2 crowns, and though she herself died young, her offspring carried forward claims and connections that would later lead to disputes over Iberian unification. Another sister, Joanna, known to history as Joanna the Mad, married Philip the Handsome of Burgundy. This marriage introduced Habsburg blood into the Spanish royal line and produced children who would inherit some of the greatest empires in European history. Among them was Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, who would later stand as Catherine's nephew and one of Henry VIII's most formidable opponents. The significance of this cannot be overstated. Catherine's very presence in England meant that she was the aunt of Charles V, the ruler whose dominions stretched from Spain and the Low Countries to the Americas and much of Italy and Austria. Her removal as queen consort was thus not only a rejection of a Spanish princess, but an affront to the Habsburg family, one of the most dominant forces in European politics. Henry's decision to cast her aside brought him into direct conflict with this network, and it helped shape the hostile relations that England endured with Spain and the wider Catholic world for decades. Catherine's other siblings also contributed to this vast web. Maria, another sister, married Manuel I of Portugal after Isabella's death, continuing the bond between Spain and Portugal. Through her, Catherine gained nieces and nephews who would later sit on the Portuguese throne. These connections meant that the Iberian kingdoms were closely bound, and Catherine could claim kinship with both Spanish and Portuguese rulers at a time when their overseas empires were rapidly expanding. This web of family alliances stretched not only across Europe but into Africa, Asia, and the Americas, as the maritime ventures of Spain and Portugal carried their dynastic influence around the globe. Even Catherine's often overlooked brothers played their part. Though Prince John of Asturias died young, cutting short the hope of a male heir for Ferdinand and Isabella, his betrothals and the negotiations surrounding him linked the family to several European courts, including those of Portugal and England. His early death only made the marriages of his sisters more significant, as they became the key instruments for Spain to secure alliances abroad. Thus, Catherine's very position as the youngest daughter placed her in a crucial role. Her destiny was to extend the family's influence through marriage, and England, with its still fragile Tudor dynasty, was seen as both an opportunity and a risk. Tracing Catherine's ancestry further back reveals even more connections. Through her mother Isabella, she descended from John of Gaunt, son of Edward III of England, through his marriage to Catherine Swynford. This link meant that Catherine carried a line of Plantagenet blood. While distant, it nonetheless tied her to English royal history in a way that gave her a kind of legitimacy as Henry's bride. It also made her marriage politically symbolic, representing not just an alliance between England and Spain, but a kind of reunion of shared bloodlines that stretched back centuries. This was not lost on contemporaries, who saw Catherine as more than just a foreign bride. She was a woman whose ancestry connected her to England's own royal past. Her Aragonese ancestry added further weight. The Crown of Aragon had long been a player in Mediterranean politics, ruling over regions of modern-day Spain, Italy, and even influencing the Crusader states. These ties meant that Catherine's forebears had connections to French, Italian, and even Byzantine rulers. She could claim descent from dynasties that had fought in the Crusades, governed Naples, and shaped the politics of southern Europe. This heritage gave her a symbolic link not only to the Christian kingdoms of the West, but also to the broader struggle against Islamic powers, which had been a defining feature of Iberian politics for centuries. Catherine herself carried these connections with a sense of dignity and pride. She was raised to understand her heritage and the responsibilities that came with it. When she came to England to marry Arthur, and later Henry, she did not see herself as a mere bride, but as a representative of one of Europe's greatest royal houses. Her education, steeped in both humanist learning and Catholic devotion, reflected the broader cultural movements of Spain, where the Renaissance was mingling with the fervor of religious reform. She embodied both the old traditions of dynastic power and the new spirit of learning and piety that was sweeping across Europe. The strength of her web of connections was both a blessing and a curse. While it gave her immense prestige and the ability to command respect at court, it also meant that any decision affecting her carried consequences across the continent. When Henry sought to annul their marriage, he was not only dealing with a personal matter, but challenging the weight of her entire family. The Pope, under pressure from her nephew Charles V, could not easily grant the annulment, and this stalemate pushed Henry toward his dramatic break with Rome. Thus, Catherine's very identity as a member of this vast royal network was one of the sparks that set off the English Reformation. Her siblings' descendants continued to shape European politics long after Catherine's own fall. Joanna's son Charles V not only ruled Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, but also fought wars against France and the Ottoman Empire, conflicts that defined much of 16th-century Europe. Maria's children with Manuel of Portugal played central roles in the Portuguese succession and in the continuation of Portugal's overseas empire. Even Isabella's brief marriage left behind dynastic claims that influenced the eventual union of Spain and Portugal under a single crown. All of these figures were part of Catherine's immediate family circle, showing how closely she was tied to some of the most important rulers of her age. Catherine's removal from power in England was therefore more than a domestic drama. It reverberated across Europe because it disrupted this entire web. To discard her was to insult the Spanish monarchy, to alienate the Habsburgs, and to unsettle alliances that had been carefully built over decades. The anger it provoked was not simply about Henry's treatment of a wife, but about his rejection of the broader European order represented in Catherine's person. This explains why the annulment was resisted so fiercely and why Henry's decision isolated England from so many of its traditional allies. In Catherine of Aragon, we find a woman who embodied the complex reality of dynastic politics. She was at once a devoted wife and mother, a queen of England, and a daughter of Spain whose siblings and nephews sat on some of the most important thrones in the world. Her story reminds us that the Tudor court cannot be understood in isolation. It was part of a vast tapestry of royal connections, one that stretched across Europe and beyond. Catherine was the thread that tied England to Spain, Portugal, the Holy Roman Empire, and even back to its own Plantagenet past. When that thread was cut, the consequences rippled outward, shaping the course of European politics for generations. This network, so often overlooked, shows us why Catherine was more than just the first wife of Henry VIII. She was a linchpin in a web of alliances that defined an age, and her fate in England reveals just how fragile and explosive such connections could be when personal desire clashed with dynastic strategy. To see her in this light is to move beyond the familiar tale of a tragic queen and to recognize her as a figure whose unseen connections altered the course of history. Anne Boleyn is remembered first and foremost as the woman who captivated Henry VIII, broke England away from Rome, and died on the scaffold only a few years after her rise. Her story is filled with drama and tragedy, and for that reason she has become one of the most famous of Henry's queens. Yet, as with Catherine of Aragon, much of Anne's importance lay not simply in her personal story, but in the web of family connections she carried with her. While she did not come from a reigning dynasty like Catherine, she was far from a mere commoner. Her lineage, particularly through her mother, Elizabeth Howard, tied her to some of the oldest noble families in England, and through these ties she was connected to the royal houses of both England and Scotland. These links are often treated as curiosities, but when examined closely they reveal how fragile the lines of succession could be, and how even a distant cousin might have reshaped the political map of Britain. The Howard family, into which Anne was born on her mother's side, was among the most powerful noble houses in England. The Howards had been influential for generations, rising to prominence under the Tudors and playing key roles in wars, diplomacy, and at court. Elizabeth Howard, Anne's mother, was the daughter of Thomas Howard, the second Duke of Norfolk. The Howards were connected to the royal family not only through their political service, but also through blood. They were descended from the Mowbrays, a family with close ties to the Plantagenets, and through them there were links that reached back to Edward I and Edward III. These ancestral strands placed the Howards, and by extension Anne Boleyn, within the broader royal bloodline of England. It is here that Anne's distant connection to the Scottish royal family comes into focus. Through the Mowbray line, Anne's ancestors were connected to the Scottish House of Stuart, the dynasty that ruled Scotland from the late 14th century onward. These ties were not close enough to place and directly in line for the Scottish throne under ordinary circumstances, but they were strong enough to give her a faint but real genealogical claim. In an age when the legitimacy of rulers was constantly contested and succession could shift dramatically with the death of a child or the annulment of a marriage, even distant connections mattered. Had the Scottish or English thrones faced different crises of succession, Anne's bloodline could have emerged as a factor in negotiations or claims. The House of Stuart itself was central to the politics of the British Isles in the early 16th century. James IV of Scotland had married Margaret Tudor, sister of Henry VIII, in what was intended as a peace treaty between England and Scotland. Their son, James V, would inherit the Scottish throne, while their granddaughter, Mary, Queen of Scots, would later become one of the most famous figures in European history. Through this marriage, the Tudors and Stuarts were already bound together, and the question of who had the stronger claim to unite England and Scotland was always simmering beneath the surface. Anne Boleyn's distant cousinship to the Stuarts may never have been raised openly during her lifetime, but it added another thread to the already complex tapestry of royal connections linking the two realms. The what-if becomes tantalizing when we consider how easily the Tudor line might have faltered. Henry's obsession with securing a male heir reveals just how precarious the dynasty felt. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon produced only one surviving child, Mary, and his union with and produced Elizabeth. Had Henry died without a son, the question of succession would have been thrown open in a way that could have allowed distant claims to surface. The fact that Anne herself had ties, however remote, to the Scottish royal line raises the possibility of alternative outcomes. Could Elizabeth, her daughter, have pressed not only her Tudor claim, but also a faint Stuart won through her mother's ancestry? Might Anne's kin have been considered as potential claimants had the Tudors collapsed early? These questions remind us that dynastic politics was never simply a matter of direct descent. Distant cousins could and did emerge as serious contenders when closer lines failed. The importance of such connections lay in the political culture of the time. In an age when legitimacy was everything, rulers and nobles scoured genealogies to justify claims. A link through a grandmother or great-grandmother could become the basis for wars or marriages. The Wars of the Roses themselves had shown how different branches of the Plantagenet family could fight over the throne of England based on such claims. By the early 16th century, this memory was still fresh, and the Tudors themselves had secured the throne only through a combination of victory in battle and marriage to unite rival houses. Against this backdrop, Anne Boleyn's family links, even if distant, were not trivial. They were part of the same fabric of dynastic politics that had repeatedly reshaped the map of England and Scotland. Anne's rise to the throne as queen consort also brought these connections into sharper focus. For Henry, marrying Anne was not only about desire or the hope of sons. It was also about aligning himself with one of the most powerful noble families in England. The Howards could trace their lineage back to kings, and Anne's cousins included dukes and courtiers with influence across the realm. This made Anne not merely a lady-in-waiting elevated by fortune, but a woman whose family background gave her a kind of legitimacy. Her kinship ties meant that, in theory, she could not be dismissed as entirely unworthy of a king's hand, even if she did not bring the continental prestige of a Catherine of Aragon. The broader European context also underscores why these hidden cousinships mattered. Scotland was not an isolated kingdom. Its rulers were deeply enmeshed in alliances with France through the long-standing Auld Alliance, which positioned Scotland as a counterbalance to English ambitions. If Anne's bloodline had been invoked as a link between England and Scotland, it might have offered an alternative path to rapprochement between the two crowns. Instead of the eventual union under James VI and I, which came nearly a century later, one could imagine scenarios where claims through Anne's lineage gave rise to negotiations or disputes earlier. While this remains speculative, it shows how the fabric of European politics was interwoven with the tiniest threads of genealogy. The implications of this are most striking when we recall how precarious Elizabeth's succession was after Anne's execution. Elizabeth was declared illegitimate by her father, and her path to the throne was never assured. Yet, when she eventually became queen, her mother's lineage became part of her identity, even if quietly acknowledged. Elizabeth's rule stabilized England and laid the groundwork for its future as a global power. But had her claim been more openly tied to her mother's distant Stuart ancestry, it might have altered how her legitimacy was perceived in Scotland and on the continent. Perhaps her eventual conflict with Mary, Queen of Scots, would have unfolded differently if Elizabeth had been seen as having her own faint Stuart claim through Anne. These possibilities remind us that Anne Boleyn's importance was not only in her immediate role as queen consort or the mother of Elizabeth, but also in the dynastic web she represented. The Tudors were constantly aware of how vulnerable they were, and the nobility around them often looked to alternative claimants as potential solutions to instability. Anne's kinship ties, like Catherine of Aragon's before her, were part of the calculations made by courtiers, foreign ambassadors, and rival monarchs. To overlook them is to miss the subtle but real ways in which dynastic politics shaped the era. In the end, Anne Boleyn's distant cousinship to the Scottish throne did not determine the course of events. Her fall and execution cut short any possibility of her own family line pressing claims beyond her daughter Elizabeth. Yet the fact that such a connection existed at all is revealing. It shows how deeply intertwined the noble families of England, Scotland, and the wider continent were. It highlights how even the rise of a woman often dismissed as an upstart was in fact grounded in centuries of noble and royal blood. And it reminds us that history is filled with paths not taken, where a slightly different twist of fate could have reshaped the destinies of kingdoms. Anne's hidden cousinship and the questions it raises are part of the same broader story as Catherine of Aragon's vast royal web. Both women show us that behind the dramatic personal tales of Henry's court lay a dense network of family connections, each with the potential to shift alliances, spark conflicts, or alter succession. To study them is to see the Tudor period not as an isolated English drama, but as a chapter in the larger European saga of dynasties, where even the most distant ties could carry immense weight. Jane Seymour often seems the quietest of Henry VIII's queens, remembered mostly for her brief reign, her ability to provide him with the long-desired son, and her tragic death soon after. Compared with Catherine of Aragon's immense continental network and Anne Boleyn's tangled noble bloodlines and dangerous politics, Jane appears almost modest in her origins. Yet when we trace her ancestry more carefully, we find that her family tree, though less celebrated, reached farther into the web of European dynasties than many contemporaries may have realized. Her kinship with imperial houses was distant, but it existed, and in a world where every thread of genealogy could be pulled into political meaning, such connections were not trivial. In fact, they gave her family a kind of silent leverage, the promise of association with powers that dwarfed England, even if those ties were never aggressively promoted. Jane was the daughter of Sir John Seymour and Marjorie Wentworth. The Seymours themselves were a respected gentry family, holding land in Wiltshire and gradually rising through loyal service to the crown. By the time Jane was born, the family had not yet reached the highest ranks of nobility, and she entered court life as a lady-in-waiting, not as a dynastic prize. Yet Marjorie Wentworth's ancestry proved far more weighty than her quiet life suggested. The Wentworths were tied by blood to the Beaufort line, and through them, to John of Gaunt, the powerful son of Edward III. John of Gaunt's descendants, both legitimate and illegitimate, were at the root of much of the royal rivalry of the late Middle Ages. Through the Beauforts, Marjorie Wentworth could trace her heritage to the House of Lancaster, and with that heritage came a subtle but real tie to the same Plantagenet stock that underpinned the Tudors' own claim to rule. This meant that Jane Seymour, like Anne Boleyn before her, could claim Plantagenet blood. In the fraught world of Tudor legitimacy, that detail mattered. Henry VII had founded the Tudor dynasty with a claim that was tenuous compared to the Yorkist and Lancastrian branches. His marriage to Elizabeth of York helped solidify his family's position, but questions of legitimacy lingered in the background. Anyone with a trace of Plantagenet heritage might, under the right circumstances, be seen as a figure with potential claims or as a useful consort to shore up the Tudor throne. Jane's connections through her mother placed her within this conversation, if quietly. More intriguingly, the same web of ancestry that linked Jane to the Beauforts also connected her distantly to the Habsburgs, the imperial house that dominated much of Europe in the 16th century. The Habsburg dynasty, sprawling across Spain, Austria, the Low Countries and beyond, had become the preeminent power of the age. Catherine of Aragon's nephew, Charles V, ruled lands so vast that they were said to be the empire on which the sun never set. To be able to trace even a faint kinship to such a house was no small thing. It did not give Jane direct influence over imperial policy, but it meant that she could not be dismissed as merely provincial. Her family, by blood, was part of the larger European mosaic, tied by threads of marriage and descent that bound England to the continent in ways both subtle and far-reaching. The impact of these connections within Henry's court should not be underestimated. When Jane came to the king's attention, it was after Anne Boleyn's turbulent fall. The court was weary of intrigue, scandal, and dangerous flirtations with foreign alliances. Jane seemed to offer a contrast, a calm, modest woman from a loyal English family, free from the French-tinged sophistication that had made and so controversial. Yet behind this surface simplicity lay the weight of her ancestry. Her kinship to Plantagenets, Beauforts, and distantly to imperial lines provided her with a quiet prestige. For Henry, who was always conscious of his dynasty's fragile roots, marrying Jane reinforced his own legitimacy by linking his children with yet another strand of noble and royal blood. This difference between Anne and Jane was stark. Anne's rise had been fueled by her connections to continental courts and reformist circles, which made her both alluring and dangerous. Jane's appeal was domestic and reassuring, yet her genealogical ties meant that she too brought with her the aura of broader European dynasties. Her family benefited from this aura almost immediately. The Seymours rose to prominence with Jane's marriage, and her brothers Edward and Thomas became central figures in the reign of her son, Edward VI. Their sudden leap from provincial gentry to the pinnacles of power was not only due to Jane's marriage, but also to the way her background could be framed as a strengthening of the Tudor line. It is worth asking what might have happened had the Seymours chosen to emphasize Jane's more distant imperial connections more openly. Henry's England was, at the time, in a precarious position diplomatically. His break with Rome had alienated Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, leaving him searching for allies. Jane herself, through her kinship to continental dynasties, could have been presented as a bridge, a way to soothe the hostility of Catholic Europe by showing that the Tudors were still connected by blood to the houses that dominated it. Yet this path was not taken, perhaps because Henry's policies made reconciliation unlikely, or because the Seymours were content to wield their influence domestically. Still, the what-if lingers. Had Jane's kinship ties been leveraged more directly, England might have found itself in a different position within the European balance of power. Perhaps her marriage could have been used to negotiate with Charles V, or to build bridges with factions within the empire who opposed France. Instead, Jane's role was confined largely to her ability to provide Henry with a male heir, which she did with the birth of Edward VI. The political capital of her family's broader ancestry was left dormant, overshadowed by immediate concerns of succession and domestic stability. Yet her death so soon after Edward's birth prevented these possibilities from ever being tested. With Jane gone, the Seymours lost their living link to the Queen, though they clung fiercely to their role as uncles to the young prince. During Edward's reign, Edward Seymour, as Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector, ruled in his nephew's name. Here again, one can imagine how the whisper of imperial kinship might have bolstered his authority abroad, had he chosen to use it. The Seymours were often criticized for their overreach, but if they had positioned themselves as relatives not only of the Tudor heir but also of imperial kin, their power might have seemed less parochial. The contrast with Catherine of Aragon is instructive. Catherine's European web was overt, explicit, and central to her identity. Her Habsburg and Spanish ties defined English foreign policy during her marriage and her fall. Anne Boleyn's connections, though less grand, still carried weight, shaping how she was perceived at home and abroad. Jane Seymour's ties, by comparison, were muted, lurking in the background, never fully articulated. Yet they were real, and they lent a quiet dignity to her role as queen. Where Catherine brought alliances and Anne brought reformist ideas, Jane brought legitimacy through blood, and in a dynasty where legitimacy was everything, that contribution should not be overlooked. Reflecting on Jane Seymour's place in the broader story of Henry's queens, we see how each woman carried within her the potential to reshape not just the English throne, but the politics of Europe. Catherine's removal ruptured England's relationship with Spain and the papacy. Anne's fall severed ties with reformist circles abroad and unsettled England's nobility. Jane's brief reign, though it seemed less dramatic, cemented the Tudor line with a male heir whose blood carried strands of Plantagenet, Beaufort, and even distant Habsburg heritage. Had she lived longer, or had her family pressed their claims more boldly, those strands might have been woven into England's diplomacy in ways that altered the balance of power. Her story illustrates the subtlety of dynastic politics. Not every connection was shouted from rooftops or inscribed in treaties. Sometimes the mere fact of descent, the quiet knowledge that a queen or her child carried imperial blood, was enough to shape perceptions. Jane Seymour may not have had the dramatic foreign alliances of Catherine or the dangerous continental ties of Anne, but she was not without her own significance. Her unexpected imperial kin made her more than just the gentle consort who gave Henry a son. She was part of the same intricate web that bound England to Europe, a web whose threads, if tugged differently, might have reshaped history. In the sequence of Henry's queens, Jane stands as a reminder that power could be exercised in silence as well as in spectacle. Her family's rise, her brief triumph, and her legacy through Edward VI all rested not only on circumstance, but also on the deeper genealogical fabric she carried. If Catherine embodied the grandeur of Spain and in the volatility of reformist Europe, Jane embodied the quiet strength of bloodlines that, though not loudly proclaimed, anchored the Tudors in the wider imperial order of the 16th century. In her veins flowed the legitimacy Henry craved, and in her death he secured the son for whom he had risked so much. The Seymour's moment of power owed as much to her hidden ancestry as to her personal fate. And so, even in her quietness, Jane Seymour reminds us that every queen of Henry's reign was more than she appeared, each carrying unseen connections that tied England to the broader destiny of Europe. When Jane Seymour's brief but pivotal queenship closed with her death, Henry VIII found himself once again without a wife, and the need for alliances weighed heavily upon him. With the memory of Catherine of Aragon's Spanish heritage and Anne Boleyn's French ties still fresh, Jane had provided a quieter legitimacy, but her passing reopened questions of diplomacy and dynastic strength. It is here that the story turns outward again, beyond the English nobility, to Anne of Cleves and Catherine Howard, two queens whose backgrounds were deeply tied to the broader European balance of power. Though remembered very differently, and as the so-called Flanders mare, whom Henry rejected after only a few months, and Catherine as the young and doomed bride executed for infidelity, their marriages cannot be understood apart from the webs of kinship and international politics they embodied. Each represented not simply Henry's private choices, but the way his dynasty was bound into the fate of Europe. Anne of Cleves arrived in England in the midst of rising tensions with Catholic Europe. Her family came from the Duchy of Cleves, a principality within the Holy Roman Empire. On the surface, this seemed a minor German duchy, far less grand than Spain or France. Yet to view Cleves in isolation is to misunderstand the strategy behind Anne's selection as Henry's bride. The Duchy of Cleves was part of a broader network of Protestant states that had emerged in defiance of Rome. Anne's brother, Duke William of Cleves, was aligned with the Schmalkaldic League, an alliance of Lutheran princes determined to resist the power of Emperor Charles V. For Henry, who had broken with Rome but had not yet secured strong allies among the Protestant powers, this connection offered the promise of security. Marrying and was intended to bring England into alignment with this network of German states, providing a counterweight to Catholic Spain and France. The web of kinship extended beyond Cleves itself. The family's ties reached into the courts of Burgundy and beyond through marriages that linked them to various German and Low Country houses. Anne's sister Sybil married John Frederick, Elector of Saxony, one of the leading figures of the Protestant movement. This alliance placed, and within a family circle that included some of the most committed defenders of Lutheranism. Her marriage to Henry was thus more than a personal arrangement. It was a deliberate attempt to position England within the wider struggle between Protestant and Catholic forces in Europe. Had Henry embraced this alliance fully, England might have become far more integrated into continental Protestant politics. The presence of Anne as queen could have served as a bridge between English reformers and their German counterparts, fostering collaboration in religion and diplomacy. Instead, Henry's disappointment in Anne's appearance and his lack of personal attraction led him to annul the marriage within months. The political consequences were significant. The hoped-for Protestant alliance collapsed, leaving England once again isolated, and remained in England as the king's sister, treated generously but sidelined, a living reminder of a union that had failed not because of diplomacy but because of Henry's whims. Yet even in failure, Anne of Cleves represented the scale of European kinship networks. She was not a mere provincial bride, but a woman whose family ties reached into the heart of the Reformation. Her presence in England demonstrated how dynastic marriages were meant to serve as instruments of policy, tools to bind nations together in common cause. The annulment revealed the limits of this system when personal preference clashed with strategy, but the attempt itself underscores how marriage was never only about affection. Catherine Howard, who followed Anne, reveals another side of this story. Where Anne embodied the Protestant alliances of continental Europe, Catherine carried within her the weight of one of England's most powerful noble families. The Howards were deeply entrenched in English politics, but their connections stretched far beyond the island. They were descended from the Mowbrays, the FitzAlans, and other great houses whose ancestry linked them to the Plantagenets and through them to the royal houses of France and Scotland. Catherine Howard's uncle, Thomas Howard, the third Duke of Norfolk, was one of the most influential men at Henry's court, and his ambitions for his family were bound up in her marriage to the king. The Howard lineage was not simply a matter of prestige. It connected Catherine to a broad array of noble and royal houses across Europe. Through the Mowbrays, the Howards could claim descent from Thomas of Brotherton, son of Edward I. This gave them a direct link to the Plantagenet kings. Through other marriages, they were tied to the French nobility and to branches of the Scottish royal family. These connections meant that the Howards were more than English grandees. They were part of the transnational web of aristocracy that shaped European politics. Catherine Howard's marriage to Henry was, therefore, not simply the union of a king with a young courtier. It was also the triumph of the Howard family, embedding their blood directly into the Tudor dynasty. For Henry, who still sought to reinforce his legitimacy and secure heirs, marrying a Howard bride meant drawing upon centuries of noble lineage. For the Howards, it was an opportunity to place themselves at the very center of power, with the possibility of producing royal heirs who carried their blood. This ambition explains much of the family's prominence during Catherine's brief queenship. Norfolk and other Howard relatives rose in influence, while Catherine herself was celebrated as a youthful, vibrant queen after the quiet dignity of Jane Seymour and the disappointing union with Anne of Cleves. Yet Catherine's downfall came swiftly when her infidelities were revealed. For Henry, the betrayal was personal, but it was also political. The disgrace of Catherine tarnished the Howard family, undermining their power at court and reminding all that even the most extensive lineage could not protect against the king's wrath. What is striking, however, is how both Anne of Cleves and Catherine Howard, despite their very different backgrounds, illustrate the same truth. Marriages in Henry's reign were never only personal choices. They were decisions laden with political significance, shaped by the web of kinship that bound England to the wider world. Anne's German alliances and Catherine's Howard lineage both represented attempts to anchor the Tudor dynasty within larger networks of power. Their failures, Anne's annulment and Catherine's execution, were not simply private tragedies, but disruptions to the delicate balance of diplomacy and nobility. Henry's foreign policy throughout his reign was shaped by this constant interplay between marriage and alliance. His first marriage to Catherine of Aragon tied him to Spain and the Habsburg Empire. His union with Anne Boleyn carried implications for relations with France and with reformist circles. Jane Seymour reinforced his legitimacy at home while offering quieter continental ties. Anne of Cleves was meant to bind him to Protestant Germany, while Catherine Howard represented the strength of England's own nobility. Catherine Parr, who would follow, brought her own connections and influence, continuing the pattern. Each queen was a thread in the tapestry of European politics, and their marriages cannot be separated from the broader context of diplomacy, war, and religion. In this sense, Anne of Cleves and Catherine Howard stand as mirror images of the same principle. One brought with her a foreign alliance, the other a domestic one. Both were tied into vast networks of kinship that extended across Europe. Both demonstrated the centrality of marriage as a tool of statecraft in the 16th century. And both reveal the risks of relying on marriage as a foundation for policy, for the unpredictability of human relationships could never be entirely controlled by dynastic strategy. Looking back, it is easy to see Henry's marriages as a series of personal dramas. Yet when placed within the context of European kinship, they become something more, reflections of the way dynasties operated, the way power was exchanged, and the way families maneuvered for influence across borders. Anne of Cleves and Catherine Howard were not merely wives who pleased or displeased a temperamental king. They were instruments of policy, bearers of bloodlines, and nodes in the vast web of European royalty. Their stories remind us that in the world of the Tudors, love was never the true language of marriage. Blood, alliance, and power always spoke louder. Catherine Howard's downfall left Henry once again shaken, his court unsettled, and his dynasty in need of stability. The Howard ambition had collapsed under the weight of scandal, and the Howard web of aristocratic ties, however rich, could not shield them from disgrace. It was in this fractured climate that Catherine Parr entered Henry's life, and with her, the story of royal connection reached its final Tudor chapter. Though Catherine Parr is often remembered as the dutiful last wife who survived the king and nursed him through his declining health, her role and her ancestry were far more significant. She embodied the very essence of the dynastic web that had run through each of Henry's marriages, and her legacy extended beyond the Tudors, binding the story of English royalty to older traditions and setting the stage for future generations. Catherine Parr was born in 1512 to Sir Thomas Parr and Maud Green. On the surface, the Parr family did not possess the grandeur of the Howards or the continental ties of the Cleves dynasty, but as with Jane Seymour, closer inspection reveals that Catherine's blood carried far more weight than it first appeared. The Parrs were connected to the Neville family through earlier marriages, and the Nevilles were among the most powerful noble families of medieval England. The Nevilles themselves were deeply interwoven with the Plantagenets, particularly through the marriage of Cecily Neville to Richard, Duke of York. Cecily was the mother of Edward IV and Richard III, making her a matriarch of the Yorkist dynasty. Thus, through her Neville kinship, Catherine Parr could trace her ancestry back to the Yorkist line. This connection is vital because the entire Tudor claim to the throne had been constructed on the union of Henry VII, a Lancastrian claimant, with Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV. Catherine Parr's Yorkist ancestry reinforced this union in a subtle way, reminding all who knew the genealogy that the Tudors were not the only inheritors of Yorkist blood. The Queen herself was tied to that same lineage, and by marrying Henry, she symbolically reconnected the Tudor monarchy to one of the most powerful branches of earlier royalty. What makes Catherine Parr particularly fascinating is that her influence extended beyond ancestry. She was married twice before becoming queen, and both marriages linked her further into England's noble fabric. Her first marriage was to Sir Edward Berg, a member of a family with close ties to northern England's aristocracy. Her second marriage, to John Neville, Lord Latimer, tied her directly to another branch of the Neville family, reinforcing her connections to the Yorkist heritage. Through these unions, Catherine became not just a queen by accident of Henry's choice, but a woman already woven into the aristocratic structure of England. Each marriage reinforced her position within that hidden web of connections that gave the nobility its collective strength. When Henry married Catherine Parr in 1543, she was in her early 30s, mature, intelligent, and deeply aware of her place within this landscape of kinship. Unlike Anne of Cleves or Catherine Howard, she did not represent a fresh foreign alliance or a single family's bid for dominance. Instead, she embodied the continuity of English dynastic history, a living link to older royal bloodlines and the noble houses that had shaped the Wars of the Roses. Her marriage to Henry symbolized a return to stability, drawing upon the weight of history to reinforce the present. Catherine's role as queen also demonstrated how these connections operated beyond the purely genealogical. She was a patron of humanist learning and religious reform, engaging directly with the intellectual currents of her day. Her support for reformist thinkers placed her within the same Protestant networks that had once made Anne Boleyn so influential, though Catherine navigated this treacherous ground with far greater caution. Her ability to maintain Henry's trust while advancing reform showed not only her personal skill, but also the strength she drew from her background. She was not an isolated consort, but a queen deeply aware of the broader political and religious currents that shaped Europe. Her kinship ties also allowed her to act as a stabilizing figure for Henry's children. Catherine became a stepmother to Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, and she worked carefully to reconcile them with their father. In doing so, she helped secure the future of the Tudor dynasty itself. Each child represented a different strand of Henry's marriages. Mary carried the Spanish and Trastamare blood of Catherine of Aragon, Elizabeth embodied the Boleyn and Howard connections, and Edward was the product of Jane Seymour's Plantagenet and Beaufort heritage. Catherine Parr, with her Yorkist descent and Neville ties, became the figure who held them together. She was, in a sense, the embodiment of the entire dynastic experiment Henry had conducted through his 6 marriages, the final strand that gathered the others into a coherent whole. It is worth reflecting on what her legacy meant for the future. After Henry's death, Catherine married Thomas Seymour, brother of Jane Seymour and uncle to King Edward VI. This marriage tied her yet again into the central nexus of Tudor power, for the Seymours were the family that controlled the government during Edward's minority. Catherine's union with Thomas demonstrated how the same families reappeared again and again in this story, each marriage reinforcing the bonds of kinship that underpinned political authority. Although Catherine died in 1548 after giving birth to her only child, her place in the network endured. Through her connections to the Nevilles, Plantagenets, and Tudors, she represented a legacy that did not end with her life, but lived on in the way English nobility and royalty understood themselves. Catherine Parr's presence also highlights the broader truth that the Tudor dynasty was not an isolated phenomenon. It was the product of centuries of intermarriage, alliance, and bloodlines that reached across Europe. The Tudors themselves were descended from Welsh gentry elevated through the marriage of Owen Tudor to Catherine of Valois, widow of Henry V. That union tied the family to French royalty. Henry VII's marriage to Elizabeth of York united Lancaster and York. Each of Henry VIII's queens added another layer. Spanish, French, German, or English noble bloodlines were woven into the dynasty. Catherine Parr, with her Yorkist descent, completed the circle, connecting the Tudors back to the older dynasties from which they had once emerged. The broader implications of these connections extend beyond Henry's reign. When Elizabeth I eventually came to the throne, she inherited not only her father's political legacy, but also this vast genealogical tapestry. Elizabeth's claim was strengthened not only by being Henry's daughter, but also by carrying within her the blood of the Boleyns, the Howards, and through her stepmother Catherine Parr's kinship, the Yorkist noblesse. In a world where legitimacy was often contested, these overlapping strands of ancestry mattered profoundly. They reassured subjects, impressed foreign powers, and reminded rivals that the Tudors were not an isolated branch, but part of the enduring web of European royalty. What Catherine Parr's life makes clear is that this web was not static. It was constantly reshaped by marriages, deaths, and shifting alliances. Catherine herself was an example of how multiple marriages could reinforce and expand these connections, binding one family to several others in succession. In her case, the Bergs, the Novilles, the Seymours, and the Tudors all became part of her story. This fluidity ensured that the English nobility remained bound together by a dense network of kinship ties, which in turn reinforced the monarchy's authority. Even after the Tudors gave way to the Stuarts, this network endured, shaping the politics of the 17th century and beyond. By the time of her death, Catherine Parr had done more than survive Henry. She had demonstrated how the legacy of royal and noble connections outlived individuals. Her ancestry, her marriages, and her role as queen all served to reinforce the idea that the monarchy was not simply the product of one family, but the convergence of many. Her legacy was a reminder that legitimacy and authority rested on a foundation far broader than a single dynasty. It was built upon centuries of interwoven bloodlines, alliances, and the careful management of kinship. When we look back at the Tudor queens as a whole, Catherine Parr stands as the quiet but enduring conclusion to the story. Catherine of Aragon brought the grandeur of Spain and the weight of Habsburg power. Anne Boleyn embodied the volatility of reformist Europe and the ambitions of the Howards. Jane Seymour carried the legitimacy of Plantagenet and Beaufort blood. Anne of Cleves represented the hope of Protestant alliances in Germany. Catherine Howard showed the peril of noble ambition unchecked. And Catherine Parr tied all these threads together, linking the Tudors back to the Yorkist past and forward into the uncertain future. Her legacy is not simply that she outlived Henry. It is that she embodied the enduring nature of royal kinship. She was the bridge between past and future, between Plantagenet and Tudor, between nobility and monarchy. Her life reminds us that history is not only the story of battles and laws, but also of families, marriages, and the hidden webs of connection that shape nations. To understand the Tudors is to see them not as an isolated dynasty, but as part of a network that spanned centuries and crossed borders. Catherine Parr's story invites us to reconsider what royal history means. It is easy to focus on Henry's dramatic choices, his wives' tragic fates, and the religious upheavals of his reign. But beneath the spectacle lies the quieter truth that each queen was a thread in a tapestry much larger than herself. Catherine Parr, through her ancestry and her marriages, demonstrates that this tapestry did not unravel with Henry's death. It continued, resilient and expansive, shaping the future of England and reminding us that dynastic history is always more interconnected than it first appears. And so the tale of Henry's 6 queens concludes not with scandal or tragedy, but with endurance. Catherine Parr's royal web outlived the Tudors themselves, a reminder that the true power of monarchy lay not in the whims of a single king, but in the hidden, intricate ties of family, blood, and history that bound England to its past and its future.